All right, hello. My name is Casey Occhialini, principal software engineer at Paramount. In a bizarre coincidence, I actually worked for Akamai for 10 years. Before that, working on media players. And all the players that I'm about to talk about, I worked on at both companies. So, this talk is about a common media library. To cut right to the chase, the idea is to consolidate some of this code we use in all the different players and get someone to sponsor it and get first class hosting for it. So when I first joined Paramount in 2019, CBS and Viacom had just completed their merger, and we had inherited a world where we used every open source player on the market, depending on which business unit we were working with. So I've actually been able to contribute to HLSJS, Dash.js, and Shaka Player, as well as other non-player related open source projects. In those adventures, I've started to notice a lot of shared or reused code between these projects, especially around standards-based features, like ID3 parsing, CMCD, CMSD, and 608, 708 captions parsing. In many cases, the code was borrowed, meaning the files were just copied and pasted from one project to the next, which leads to all the obvious problems that you can think of, like bugs getting fixed in one place and not the other, certain feature sets being implemented based on a business unit's needs and not included across all the projects, etc. The other problem that I have personally is around documentation. Most of the features I mentioned earlier are subcomponents of the larger player project, so you get lucky sometimes, especially around stuff that deals with binary parsing and manipulation, where you'll get decent code level comments, but because these features aren't part of the player's public API, the comments don't make their way to the public documentation. Having these features live in their own standalone library would be a good chance to surface these comments as public API docs. And that is the general idea of the project, to consolidate these features into a collection of standalone modules. One place I noticed this type of code sharing was in CMCD. So here's Will's tickets for implementing CMCD across the players. We really wanted to do this work, so we raised our hand to implement the feature in HLSJS and Shaka Player. Dash.js had implemented the feature first, so we used that as a template. My initial idea was, hey, there's some shared functionality here, let's make a standalone library for CMCD. For those that are unfamiliar with CMCD, it's basically a way to pass serialized data about a piece of media with each request for video, audio, text, and DRM across the playback session. The serialization code is player independent, so I started with a standalone project, but then as I tried to introduce that library into the players, I would get responses along the lines of, we don't feel comfortable including someone's personal library in our code base, which, in all honesty, is a very valid concern. And so what did I do? I copied and pasted the code across the projects, just like I've been complaining about. So the idea for a common media library actually came before our work on CMCD. For anyone who hasn't heard Dan Sparacio's Caption Me If You Can talk from Demux last year, captions seem to be the source of many of my day-to-day challenges as a video developer. And so here's a bug we ran into where captions weren't displaying on Xbox. And long story short, the easiest way to fix it was to not use HLSJS on this particular platform and just let the video tag play it itself, because Xbox uses an older version of the Edge browser, which supports direct playback of HLS streams. Great, we have captions back, legal is off our back, and of course that immediately breaks ID3 parsing, so now we aren't getting paid for our views. So obviously this problem's been solved before. I'm a big fan of reusing code instead of writing it yourself, as much as I really do like writing code. So I went out and looked for an existing library that does this. Surely there's an NPM module that will work for me. Unfortunately, when you look at an NPM, there are a bunch of ID3 packages, but they are all for music, parsing ID3 titles, genre, and stuff from MP3 files, but nothing for ID3s as we use them in the video world. So this led to the question, how does everybody else do it? I know all the players handle ID3s out of the box, so I went and dug into the libraries, and it turns out they're identical. Minus white space and a conversion to TypeScript, they are pretty much the same. Once again, I said, great. The player we develop at Paramount uses TypeScript, so we'll go with the TypeScript one and save ourselves a step. But then as you dig into it a little bit, it turns out they are not the same. You can see here the isTimestampFrame function was implemented in HLS, but not in the Shaka version. And over here, Shaka made some fixes around the offset. I'm not quite sure how this works since it's messing with lengths and stuff, but it does, and it doesn't exist in the HLS.js version. Now I have to ask, which one do we use? Which one is right? Short of reading the entire spec and trying to figure it out myself, it's really hard to say. This was the first time I said, man, I really wish this code was in a standalone library so that I can import it to solve this one little problem on one specific platform. Of course, once I started looking, I noticed it everywhere. These are the CEA 608 parsers from Dash.js and HLS.js. And look, they're the same, including spelling mistakes. But as with previous slides, upon closer inspection, you start to notice the differences. Does anyone know if NR calls should be 32 or 100? I don't. Having some of this stuff documented could be nice and would be available in a standalone library, but none of these code comments here make their way up to the public API docs. In this case, the comments in Dash.js are obviously more complete than the generic utils comment in HLS.js, but that's not always so, and you run into scenarios where you don't know which one is the best to use. I ran into similar issues with CMCD. In the process of copying code between projects, I found a small string encoding bug with the original Dash.js implementation, which I then had to go over there and solve as well. I don't know if anyone else has to deal with building multiple open source players, but juggling the different build tools and infrastructure for each project can be very frustrating. For me personally, having one common library with one set of build tools would be much easier to work with. There's another problem when things are implemented independently across multiple projects. Sometimes pieces get dropped. For CMCD, my company had specific feature requirements they wanted implemented, which I was given time to work on, but anything outside of that, I was on my own. Because of this, there is some stuff around next object requests that I just never got to. Not to say that this piece of code is necessarily shareable, but again, if the original feature was written in a single library, everybody wins. So, what's the plan? We want to make a modern JavaScript library for media playback. For those familiar with Lodash, the project would be laid out in a similar manner to Lodash, where we export individual functions or classes for more complex features, all as standalone files that can be imported without including the entire library. Overbundling is one problem that we've run into where, for instance, you import a library because you need simple MP4 box parsing, but now you've included all the code to process FLV files. We'll achieve this by writing the library in TypeScript and compiling to modern JavaScript. We intentionally won't bundle, minify, transpile, or polyfill any of the final code. This is because every major application framework used today already provides this functionality. This is also true for each of the open source players. They all have build tools that will handle this step, so there's no need to do it twice. The library will make use of Node's export mapping and browser import maps. This will provide a clean route to importing only the pieces of the library that are needed, no matter which platform is being used, whether it be Node, Dino, the browser, or newer platforms like Bun. We also plan to use TypeScript-based tools like tsdoc to provide thorough API documentation for each piece of the library, and API extractor to ensure strict adherence to Semver rules. While we haven't determined which framework will be used, tests will be a top priority, with the goal of having full coverage through a combination of unit and end-to-end tests. Now that we have an idea of what we want to build, the next question is, where will this live? This is my original CMCD project, which is still up there, and I plan on contributing the code to the Common Media Library at some point, but as I mentioned before, there was pushback on using a personal project, so the idea is to find some sort of industry group or community-based organization, even if it's a GitHub org, where these things could live, which would also provide protection against left pad type incidents where someone intentionally or unintentionally deletes a library or breaks it on you. There's another interesting use case where the ISO box parser that Dash.js uses was archived. And so they said, hey, we still use it. Would you mind handing over the ownership of the project? And they did. They did a GitHub transfer, and now Dash.js owns the project. The problem is the original code owner couldn't find the npm publish keys. So Dash.js owns the code, but they can't publish the package. This means they have to manually bundle it into their code base, and now we're back to the original problem where a reusable chunk of code is buried deep inside a player library. The other reason for reaching out to a community or industry group comes from my work with Dash.js. They have a monthly sync-up meeting via WebEx, and they are the only open source player project I know that does this, and it is super helpful. It's the quickest and easiest way to sync up with everybody, hear what's coming up, hear what everybody's working on, push your PRs that you need merged, etc. I really like attending that meeting, and so having the project hosted by a larger organization would give us project management tools and resources to more easily organize recurring meetings of our own. Originally, we talked to Will thinking CTA Wave might be a good home. Both CTA Wave and SVTA have a general goal of improving interoperability in the streaming ecosystem. We think a common media library aligns with that goal pretty well, so we reached out to CTA Wave, and somehow someone at SVTA found out about it and reached out to us directly. The SVTA has a dedicated player working group and already had some JS projects on GitHub, so we decided to work with them on hosting the project. The main downside with either of the industry groups is that they are members-only organizations. We feel that in order for the library to be widely adopted, we need all developers to have access and be able to pull and contribute code. We are working with the SVTA to make sure the library is open for everyone, but managed by the group. Ideally, it would operate just like the open source players do, where you import an npm package directly when you want to use the library, and if you want to contribute a bug fix or a feature, you'd fork the code and submit a PR upstream for approval. We also considered video dev as a home for the project, but felt it didn't provide enough organization for what we are trying to achieve. Moving forward, the plan is to take a phased approach to building library features. We have identified a few easy wins like ID3 and 608, maybe caption rendering, that would be great first candidates. We've talked to the library owners of Dash.js, HLS.js, and Shaka Player to gauge interest levels in the project and get some ideas for potential features. So far, everyone seems to be on board, and Dash.js has even volunteered some code that we could use, which is really cool. These discussions have also helped us identify a few potential hazards as well, especially around licensing, which will most likely be MIT, as it seems to be the most acceptable to corporate contributors. We also plan on reaching out to other projects in the video space, like Video.js and Mux, to get their input as well. So, the following list is not a roadmap. It's more of a random list of loosely organized features. The items in Phase 1 are mostly there because I know where to get the code and I know how I'd like to port them over. Phase 2 are features that I know where the code is, but porting it over may take some more thought. Phase 3 is more like moonshots. All players do these things, but they do them differently, and they're usually deeply integrated into each player's architecture. Converting them into common utilities will take some work. For instance, in theory, you should be able to come up with a common functional ABR framework. After all, it's really just a list reduction, but extracting the necessary pieces of state to make that reduction from each player will be interesting. We're certainly open to suggestions on all of these items. Another interesting category that's not on here is polyfills. There's a number of media-centric browser APIs that are inconsistently implemented across the browsers. And libraries like Shaka actually have a nice collection of polyfills to normalize the behavior across the different platforms, especially things like connected TVs. As I mentioned before, there are definitely still some open questions, finalizing the licensing being the big one. We also need to make sure that the project is administered in an open enough manner that we can get as many video devs involved as possible. We don't want SVTA membership to be a limiting factor. And of course, the hardest problem of all is finalizing the name. We were really shooting for a 4-letter power acronym like CMCD or CMSD, but couldn't find anything that fit quite right. I guess we could add a J for JavaScript and make it CMJL or W for Web, CMWL, or maybe Common Media Library is fine as it is. We welcome any feedback. And that's it. If anyone has any questions, you can email me at casey.occhialini@paramount.com or reach out to me on Video Dev Slack. Thanks.